They said he had no one left in the world. No family, no friends, no hope. But one soul never left him. A dog who chose loyalty over everything, even life. The town of Grayford was the kind of place people passed through, not the kind they stayed in. A single cracked road cut through it like an old scar, lined with tired shops, rusted signboards, and houses that looked as though they had given up long ago. Winters were harsh, summers unforgiving, and hope was something most people here stopped talking about. Ethan Cole lived at the edge of that town, in a small wooden house that leaned slightly to one side, as if even it was exhausted from standing too long. He was 38 years old, though life had aged him far beyond that. His hair was already streaked with gray, his eyes permanently tired, and his shoulders carried a weight no one could see. Once Ethan had dreams. Once he believed life would be kind. But life had other plans. 5 years ago, everything he loved collapsed in a single year. First, his job at the factory disappeared when the machines replaced men. Then came the hospital bills. His wife, Clara, had fallen ill suddenly, too fast, too cruel. And by the time the doctors said the words Ethan feared most, it was already too late. Cancer. She was gone within months. The house that once echoed with laughter became a place of unbearable silence. The walls felt closer. The nights felt longer. And Ethan learned something terrible. Grief doesn't scream all the time. Sometimes it just sits quietly beside you, breathing. After Clara's death, Ethan stopped talking to people. He stopped caring about mornings. He stopped caring about himself. That was when he found the dog. It was a freezing evening when it happened. Snow fell in slow, tired flakes, covering the road in white. Ethan was walking back from a temporary job, loading boxes at a warehouse for barely enough money to survive. His boots were worn, his coat thin. That's when he heard it. A sound so small it almost disappeared into the wind. A whimper. Ethan stopped. At the side of the road, near a broken fence, was a shape curled tightly into itself. A dog, skinny, shaking, its ribs clearly visible beneath dirty fur. One ear was torn, one eye half closed with infection. A rope mark circled its neck like a cruel memory. The dog didn't bark. It didn't move. It only looked at Ethan with eyes that had learned the language of abandonment. "Hey," Ethan whispered, surprised at the sound of his own voice. The dog flinched. Ethan crouched slowly, careful not to scare it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only food he had left, a piece of dry bread. He broke it in half and placed it on the ground, then stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the dog crawled forward inch by inch, ate the bread like it might vanish at any second, and looked up again. That look did something to Ethan. It wasn't hope. It was recognition. Two broken souls, standing on the same road. "Guess it's just you and me tonight," Ethan said softly. The dog followed him home. Ethan didn't plan to keep the dog. He barely had enough money for himself. But that night, as the dog curled up near the heater, shivering less than before, something strange happened. The silence changed. It wasn't empty anymore. He cleaned the dog's wounds as best he could. The dog never growled, never resisted, just watched him, trusting someone for the first time in a long while. "I'll call you Shadow," Ethan said quietly. "Because you don't leave." Shadow lifted his head, as if understanding. That night, Ethan slept for more than 2 hours for the first time in months. Days passed. Then weeks. Shadow healed slowly. Ethan shared his food, even when it meant eating less himself. In return, Shadow followed him everywhere, work, walks, even sitting outside the house while Ethan slept. The town noticed. "That dog saved you," an old shopkeeper once said. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't know how to explain that the dog hadn't saved him. The dog reminded him he was still alive. But life is never kind for long. Winter grew harsher. Work became scarce. Bills stacked up like accusations. Some nights, Ethan lay awake listening to Shadow's breathing, wondering how long he could protect this fragile peace. One night during a violent storm, the power went out. The house was swallowed by darkness. Thunder shook the walls. Shadow whimpered. Ethan sat up and wrapped his arms around the dog. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure it was. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, two hearts beat faster. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would test loyalty, sacrifice, and love in ways neither man nor dog could imagine. Because some bonds are not formed by comfort. They are forged in survival. Winter did not loosen its grip on Grayford. If anything, it tightened it. Snow piled higher against Ethan's house, pressing against the walls like a silent threat. The heater coughed more than it worked, and the electricity flickered as if even it was unsure whether to stay. Each morning, Ethan woke before the sun, his breath visible in the cold air, Shadow curled tightly against his legs. Shadow had grown stronger. His fur was cleaner now, his eyes clearer, his steps confident. But there was something in him that never changed, his constant watchfulness. Wherever Ethan went, Shadow followed. Wherever Ethan stopped, Shadow waited. As if the world had already taught him one cruel lesson too many. Work became harder to find. The warehouse job ended suddenly, no warning, no apology. "We're cutting costs," the supervisor said, not even meeting Ethan's eyes. Ethan nodded, used to disappointment. Days turned into long walks around town, asking for work that didn't exist. Shadow walked beside him, tail low but steady, matching Ethan's pace step for step. Some people smiled at the dog. Some crossed the street. "Dogs slow you down," one man muttered as Ethan passed. Ethan said nothing. Shadow did not slow him down. Shadow kept him standing. One afternoon, hunger pressed harder than usual. Ethan hadn't eaten since the previous day. He broke the last piece of bread into two parts and placed the larger one in Shadow's bowl. Shadow sniffed it, then stepped back. Ethan frowned. "Go on." Shadow didn't move. After a moment, Shadow picked up the bread gently, walked over, and dropped it back into Ethan's hand. Ethan froze. Something broke inside his chest. "You idiot," Ethan whispered, laughing and crying at the same time. "You're supposed to eat." Shadow simply sat watching him. They shared the bread. That night the knock came. 3 sharp knocks on the door. Ethan's heart tightened. No one knocked anymore. He opened the door to find a man in a thick coat, clipboard in hand. "Property tax notice," the man said flatly. "You're 3 months overdue." "I'll pay," Ethan said quickly. "I just need time." "You've had time." The man glanced past Ethan and frowned. "Dogs aren't allowed if you're renting." "I own this place," Ethan said. "For now." The man handed him the paper and walked away. Ethan closed the door slowly. Shadow watched him. "I'm not losing you," Ethan said quietly, "no matter what." Shadow pressed his head into Ethan's leg. Weeks later, everything fell apart. The storm that hit Grayford that night was the worst in decades. Snow fell so thick it erased the road. The wind screamed like something alive. A tree crashed nearby, shaking the ground. The power went out again, this time for good. By morning, the house was freezing. Ethan wrapped himself in blankets. Shadow stayed close, but even his warmth wasn't enough. Ethan's hands shook uncontrollably. His chest burned when he breathed. By afternoon, he collapsed. Shadow didn't understand sickness, but he understood danger. He barked. He barked louder than he ever had before. He scratched at the door, ran to the window, barked again. Hours passed. His voice grew hoarse, but he didn't stop. Finally, a neighbor heard. Ethan woke up in a hospital bed. Bright lights, beeping machines, a tightness in his arm from the IV. And Shadow was gone. Panic hit him harder than the illness. "Where's my dog?" Ethan croaked. The nurse hesitated. "Animals aren't allowed. Animal control took him." Ethan tried to sit up. "No, no, you don't understand." But they didn't understand. They never did. The moment Ethan was discharged, weak and dizzy, he went looking. Animal control, shelters, kennels. "He's a mixed breed, black, one torn ear," Ethan said again and again. Some shook their heads. Some didn't look. Finally, a tired woman behind a desk said, "We sent him to the county shelter. They're full." Ethan's stomach dropped. Full meant days. Full meant decisions. He borrowed money. He walked for hours. He ignored the pain in his chest. When he arrived, the shelter smelled of disinfectant and fear. Barking echoed off concrete walls. A worker led him down a long hallway. Dogs pressed against cages, some hopeful, some broken. Then Ethan saw him. Shadow sat at the back of a cage, silent, eyes fixed on the door. When he saw Ethan, he didn't bark. He ran forward so fast he hit the metal bars. Ethan dropped to his knees. "I'm here," he whispered, tears streaming. "I'm here." The worker cleared her throat. "He's scheduled for evaluation tomorrow. You'll need a fee to take him." Ethan nodded. "I'll get it." He didn't know how. But he would. That night, Ethan made a decision. The next morning, he walked into a construction site and asked for work. They laughed at his thin frame, his shaking hands. "Just give me one day," he said. "I'll do anything." They gave him a shovel. He worked until his vision blurred, until his hands bled, until his lungs burned. By sunset, he had the money. He returned to the shelter and paid without counting. When Shadow walked out beside him, leash loose, eyes bright, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. But peace never lasts. A few days later, while walking home, Shadow froze. A car slowed beside them. A man leaned out. "That dog yours?" "Yes," Ethan said, tightening his grip. "That looks like my dog," the man said. "Ran away months ago." Shadow growled low. Ethan's heart pounded. He was beaten, starved, left to die. The man shrugged. "Dogs wander." "No," Ethan said firmly. "People abandon." The man scowled but drove off. Ethan didn't relax until the car disappeared. That night, Shadow slept with his head on Ethan's chest, as if guarding his heart. Ethan found a job soon after, night security at an old warehouse. It paid little, but it paid regularly. Shadow stayed with him during the shifts, silent and alert. Together, they watched the empty halls. Together, they survived. Ethan talked to Shadow about Clara, about his fears, about the future. Shadow listened. Always. But the world had one final test waiting. One night during a late shift, a fire broke out nearby. Smoke filled the air. Sirens screamed. In the chaos, Shadow ran toward the flames. "Shadow," Ethan shouted. The leash slipped from his hand. Ethan ran after him, heart pounding, fear ripping through his chest. Because some bonds are tested not by comfort, but by what we are willing to lose. Smoke clawed at the sky, turning the night into something unreal. Red and blue lights flashed wildly as fire trucks screamed down the road. Ethan ran, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Shadow," he shouted again. The warehouse across the street was burning. Flames licked the walls hungrily, devouring everything they touched. People gathered at a distance, fear rooting them in place. Shadow had disappeared into the smoke. Without thinking, Ethan ran forward. A firefighter grabbed his arm. "You can't go in there." "My dog is inside," Ethan gasped. "Please." The firefighter, hesitated for a second too long. Ethan broke free and ran. The heat hit him instantly. Smoke blinded his eyes, tore at his throat. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and moved blindly, calling Shadow's name over and over. Then he heard it. A bark. Faint, choked, desperate. Shadow. Ethan followed the sound, stumbling over fallen debris. Flames crackled above him. A beam collapsed behind him, cutting off the exit. Panic rose, but he pushed it down. He found Shadow trapped under a fallen metal shelf, whimpering, eyes wide with fear. His fur was singed, his leg bleeding. "I've got you," Ethan whispered, tears streaming. "I won't leave." Ethan lifted the shelf with strength he didn't know he had. He scooped Shadow into his arms and turned. And the ceiling collapsed. They woke up in the same place. Or at least that's how it felt. Ethan opened his eyes to a soft white glow. There was no pain, no noise, just warmth. Shadow lay beside him, calm, breathing steadily. Ethan smiled weakly. "We made it." But then he noticed something strange. The air felt timeless. A voice spoke, not aloud but deep inside him. "Love is never wasted." Ethan looked down at Shadow. Memories flooded his mind. The road, the bread, the shelter, the nights of hunger and hope. He understood then. Some beings come into our lives not to stay forever, but to save us long enough to save ourselves. Ethan woke up in a hospital bed. Again. Machines beeped softly. His body ached, but he was alive. A doctor stood nearby. "You were lucky. If you'd arrived 2 minutes later." Ethan turned his head desperately. "My dog, where is he?" The doctor's face softened. "He's in surgery. Severe injuries, but he protected you, took most of the impact." Hours passed like years. Finally, a nurse entered. "He made it," she said quietly. Ethan broke down. Recovery was slow. Shadow walked with a limp that never fully healed. Ethan's lungs were permanently weakened, but every morning they woke up together. News of the fire spread. A local paper ran a small headline. "Man risks life to save dog. Dog saves man." People who had never noticed Ethan before now stopped to talk. Donations came in. A shelter offered Ethan work, helping animals like Shadow. For the first time in years, life didn't feel like punishment. One quiet evening, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shadow lay beside him, older now, slower, his breathing shallow but peaceful. "You know," Ethan said softly, "you saved me long before that fire." Shadow lifted his head slightly. "I think God knew I wouldn't listen to people," Ethan smiled. "So he sent me you." Shadow's tail moved once. That night, Shadow slept deeper than ever before. And in his sleep, he slipped away. Ethan found him in the morning. Peaceful. Still. For a moment, the world went silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It didn't hurt. Months later, Ethan walked the same road where he had once found a broken dog in the snow. He stopped near the broken fence, now repaired. He placed a small wooden marker there. Shadow. He taught a man how to live. Ethan smiled. Some love does not die. It transforms. And sometimes, God sends a dog to save a human soul.